This is Ruben Puentedura, and what I'd like to talk about today is what makes for a good game. Now, last time we talked about what makes for a game in general, but some games are very good, some games are very bad, and this is going to be important if we're going to be using games in education. So, what's the difference between a good game and a bad game? Let's see. I want to talk about two games. The first one is recognized as one of the very best video games of all time, and it's called Pitfall. So here's Pitfall. What you're looking at here, by the way, is not a scene from a YouTube movie. This is actually my play through the game. So you can see they have screens. You have to jump over barrels. You can duck out of their way or jump over them. And the screen progresses from left to right. In this case, you can use vines to jump over things. Obviously, that scorpion would not be nice. You'll notice that getting hit by a barrel takes away points. Here I have to jump over some crocodiles, so I'm timing things carefully so as not to get eaten by the crocodiles. Again, I've gotten hit by a barrel, lose some more points, but I don't die yet, so keep going. Here I'm just ducking out of the way of some of the barrels. I keep on going from left to right. And now I come to another screen with another challenge, and whoops, here I did die. So clearly not all challenges are, shall we say, just point loss like the barrels. Now I have to get beyond that snake. I jump over it. Aha, a trap opens up. I stop. I look carefully to see what the timing of the trap is. And once I have that, I run quickly, dodge it, and pick up the first treasure in the screen. So you can see that in this game, which ran on an Atari 2600, I have a huge variety of challenges. I have something that's clearly depicted as a forest. This is a fun game, even on the primitive hardware that was the Atari 2600. Okay, so that's one of the best video games of all time. We'll come back to analyze it a little bit more in just a second. But now let's look at one of the worst video games of all time. And that game is E.T. Now, E.T. is a somewhat infamous game because it's been credited with the downfall of Atari. That point is arguable. Atari had other problems besides this game, but it can't be doubted that E.T. was certainly no help to the company. So after E.T. lands, E.T. finds himself in this landscape, which you wonder, what is this? Well, it turns out it's a ground full of holes. And E.T. wanders around. Notice that nothing much is happening. Think about what happened in the early scenes of Pitfall by comparison. Some icons are at the top, never explained anywhere except in the manual, and certainly not intuitively obvious. And we have this character also showing up on screen. Doesn't seem to be doing anything very clear. Again, think of, by contrast, the barrels or the crocs. Aha, E.T. has just fallen into a well and has found a piece of the machine E.T. needs to get back home. And that's pretty much the game. You fall over pieces and wells and get captured by the scientist and sent back to the beginning, and that's pretty much it. So there's really no great variety here. That little blob there on the left is a Reese's Pieces. E.T. can look for pieces but then gets bumped into wells. It's frequently hard to get out of wells, and quite frankly, once you fall into a well enough times, you decided, okay, this is pretty boring, and you either stayed there forever ever after, or more likely just turn the machine off, yank the cartridge, put Pitfall back in, and decide to have a good time instead. Okay, so I think it's pretty clear just from these two videos that one was a fun game, the other one was not a fun game. Can we make our analysis a little bit more quantitative, a little bit more accurate, shall we say, than this? And the answer is yes. Ralph Koster, in particular, in a book called The Theory of Fun, has analyzed the elements that make a game fun or not to play. Now, one of the key things that Ralph says is listen to your players. And these are 6 things that players can say that tell you right away how and why a game is fun or not fun. And these are: the game is too easy, the game is too involved, the game is too hard, the game becomes too repetitive, the game becomes too hard, or the game runs out of options. We'll look at these in groups in more detail, but notice that these are all complaints, and this is an important thing. It's important not just to say, oh, the players like the pretty colors on the screen, or they really like the noise that this character makes, it's important to say, well, what didn't they like, as a key to what's essentially in need of fixing about the game, or what's essentially not working there. So it's important to lead off, shall we say, not with the praise, but with the complaints in this case. All right, so let's look at the first three. When players say the game is too easy, they say that game patterns are too simple. In other words, the patterns involved in the game are just not challenging enough. They figure them out right away, and that's it. By contrast, when they say the game is too involved, what they're talking about is they're saying, look, we know there are patterns out there, but frankly, we're not interested in the information that's required to detect those patterns. So it's not that there aren't patterns, and it's not a question of their simplicity or complexity, it's just we just don't find them interesting, we just don't find them compelling. And finally, when the players say the game is too hard, they're saying there may be patterns, but you know what, the whole thing looks totally random, totally unfair, it's just noise, I don't feel like playing this anymore, thank you very much. Now, those three items can all be illustrated with this single screen from E.T. And believe me, these complaints were heard in tons about E.T. And here you go. Because we're saying here that the game is too easy, okay? After you've done this for a few seconds, you realize all you're going to be doing is falling into holes and getting out of holes. Not exactly a thrilling range of patterns available. At the same time, you're also saying, you know, you have all those cryptic little icons at the top. What are those? You know, what in the game is telling me what they do? Well, absolutely nothing. You would have had to read the manual, and even then, it wasn't necessarily all that clear. In other words, the player would have been uninterested in the information about those patterns. And finally, when you're talking about things like the appearance of the bad characters here, like the scientist, there didn't seem to be any particular rhyme or reason to it. So that seemed to be, well, you know, it's just not anything that I can perceive the reason for the patterns. In other words, that's making the game too hard. So right off the bat, you can see these three items in operation in why E.T. was not a fun game. The other three are also pretty clear to see in E.T. The game becomes too repetitive. Well, it wasn't even a question of became too repetitive, but it was too repetitive from the start. But for games that start out as fun but become less fun over time, you're saying, well, you're adding new patterns too slowly. In other words, there aren't enough new things to do. When you say the game becomes too hard, it's the converse. You're now adding patterns too fast so that, jump up a couple of lines, those patterns are being perceived as noise. And finally, when you say that the game runs out of options, well, that's it. You did everything there was in the game, and it's game over. And the trouble is, if this coincides with the ending of the game, you're fine. But if the game still goes on for several hours beyond this point, well, you've exhausted all game patterns, and the players say, I'm just rehashing the same terrain over and over again. That's not why I play games. Okay. So that's, how we say, the negative side of things. And right off the bat, as I say, it applies to E.T. Now let's look at the positive side of things. So let's look at what successful games have. So this is where players are saying, I like this. I really like how this is working out in this game. So the first thing we're going to be looking at in terms of a group is just the top item. And that's to say, okay, preparation before challenges are included in all successful games because you don't want results due to pure chance. And here are two screens from Pitfall that illustrate this point. You start out by leaping over one barrel and having one ladder or one hole to fall down into. So you're prepared with, how do I leap over a barrel, or how do I get out of its way, go down or up a hole, before you get to the next screen where you now have multiple barrels, multiple holes, and more strategies to consider in terms of what you're doing. But the game is fair. It's not throwing at you right off the bat with no apparent reason the tough challenge. It says, hey, you can train on this easier one first. The other 5 items can also be illustrated with a series of illustrations from Pitfall. So let's look at them all together because they're all interconnected. A sense of a game space. Okay, the game takes place in a space, and that's a combination both of a physical space as well as a narrative space. And that avoids the perception of the game being trivial or not interesting. Now, that doesn't mean that it corresponds to a real-world game space. For instance, we saw that an abstract game space is fine, but it has to have a definite construct. It has to look like something that was constructed, conceived. Think back to the system with a set of rules that we talked about last time, not something that I just pulled out of thin air for no good apparent reason. You also have to have a solid core mechanic. In other words, you want the game to be perceived as a game. You want to have certain activities. You see it in Pitfall: gather goodies, avoid the bad guys. If you don't have that, the game may just not be perceived as a game at all. It might be either, well, it's a space for exploration, but it's not a game, or it could be perceived as random and unfairly punishing, etc. A range of challenges. You don't want the game to be exhausted too quickly. In other words, if it's just one thing that you have to do, well, you learn how to do it and you're done. A range of required abilities. You don't want the game to just have you do one thing. When you hear players, for instance, complain that certain games are button mashers, they're referring to games that frankly have one skill needed, which is just how fast can you push one or two buttons. And those games are perceived as simplistic, and no serious gamer, in fact, no gamer, whether serious or otherwise, really plays them for very long. And finally, skill in using the required abilities. In other words, you don't want this to be, well, you pick it up and you say, oh, I have to push a button and that's it. It's got, well, there have to be items like timing. There have to be items like a planning of a strategy, even a basic rhythm involved, because otherwise you're going to have a game being perceived as tedious. In other words, a game that has you just push buttons as busy work. And again, you can see all of these positive items in these three screens from Pitfall. Okay, first, the sense of game space. Notice that the game has a very strong sense of a game space, both in terms of the forest or jungle that the character is traversing, also in terms of a narrative space, in terms of progressing through these screens to pick up goodies, but being thwarted or at least somewhat blocked along the way by crocodiles and scorpions and snakes and barrels and whatnot. In other words, it has a very, very strong sense of a space. At the same time, you also have a whole range of challenges that are proposed. In other words, you are being proposed here with not just a range of one, okay, so just leap over barrels and that's it. You have to do different things like judge timing, judge jumps, decide which way am I going to go. So there's a range of different challenges being involved here. A solid game mechanic, which I just skipped over for a second. I think it's pretty clear that is present throughout. Nobody certainly would say that this would not be perceived as a game. And then you have both a range of required abilities and skill in using those required abilities. Again, you're not just doing one thing, you're not just pushing one button, you're doing different things with the joystick and the button, and you have to become progressively more skillful at what you do using that joystick and button if you're going to make it successfully through the game. So those components, those elements, these basic items are essential to what makes Pitfall fun. Now, I'm going to recommend a mini exercise after you've listened to this podcast, and that is, just like we took E.T. to look at the complaints and Pitfall to look at what people said was good, to reverse that. Take the screen I recorded for Pitfall and analyze it for the absence of those items that lead to complaints, and conversely take the screens from E.T. and analyze it for the absence of those elements that lead to compliments from players. There are three more items that are key for success that have been identified by Ralph Koster. And these are items that, while they're present in Pitfall and largely absent in E.T., we have to look at a much longer span of the games to get at. So I'm not going to illustrate these with images, but I do want to talk about them here. So the first one is you need to have variable feedback, because players like to see greater skill resulting in greater rewards. If you've just picked up the game and are basically fumbling with the controller, and you get exactly the same score as somebody who has been playing it for years, that's very unsatisfying to players. Why should you develop these skills that we talked about before if there's not going to be any reward in it? Well, there has to be variable feedback. And again, there is variable feedback actually in both games, to be fair to them. But in Pitfall, the variable feedback is much more rewarding in terms of how point values are related to how skillfully you navigate the landscape and how many of the treasures you get. In E.T., it's a much more boring affair that's just, frankly, time determined, and because of the non-skill related difficulties of the game, such as getting out of those drab pits and the randomness of the presence of the other components, it's a much less satisfying form of variable feedback. But either way, you do need to have this. A second item is a way to accommodate beginners and experts playing together. Now, this is less crucial in games where people are playing mostly by themselves. But as we're going to come back to this point later, even players who play by themselves tend to have a social component where either other people are watching them play, or at the very least they're talking with other people about their game experiences. So if a game allows for both beginners and experts to play either definitely the same game together, or at the very least share experiences in ways that are meaningful to each other, that game will do better than one that caters almost exclusively to one crowd or the other. And there are many ways of doing this. We'll see some of them in later podcasts. But the key thing is you don't want the two to be playing only for one to be at the expense of the other. So if they're playing a game jointly, you don't want the skillful player to be able to make mincemeat out of the less skilled player each and every time. Sometimes you can do that with level settings, difficulty settings, but there are other ways of working around this, and we'll talk more about this, for instance, when we get to World of Warcraft and other games that take place in large social groups online. And finally, a definite cost for failure. And again, this is something that I've briefly pointed towards in the first podcast when I said that people don't like games that have absolutely no conflict of any sort built in. This is directly related to that. People don't like games that say everybody wins no matter what they do. It can be that different players can find different levels of achievement or satisfaction within the game, but quite frankly, the type of everybody wins game is a game that nobody, frankly, likes to play. So in other words, gamers do want there to be a cost for failure. Now that has to be a fair cost, and as I say, there can be relative levels. So you can say, well, I got up to this level in the game, and a more skilled player got up to a more advanced level in the game. But a game where your character can never die, and if the character lands on the snake, it just says, haha, joke, snake won't hurt you at all. Nobody enjoys those games. On a side note on this, I'll point out that a very interesting phenomenon that has happened in recent years has been the development of systems in the online arenas, such as, for instance, for those players that play on the Xbox 360, to show that they can conquer not just the heart of the game, but actually subsets of aspects of the game better or worse than other players. And these are called achievements, and they're directly connected to this idea of a definite cost for failure, and then the converse, which would be a definite reward for non-failure, and a definite reward for, going back to variable feedback, doing things better, even if it's just a subset of the game, than some other player might. So from Koster's research, all of these are the key elements that make a game fun or not fun. I'm going to take a second here before I close out by proposing a small exercise, by suggesting now that you take a minute, go back, look through these sets of items that I've talked about, and think about them in terms of what happens in the classroom. Because while I've talked about all of this in the context of a game, by changing the language just slightly, just a little bit, you can see that many of these items can be connected to what makes a class interesting, fascinating, or boring, trivial, uninteresting. Again, I'll leave the exact paralleling of these items to items of teaching up to you, but it's worthwhile thinking about, and we'll come back more to this later when we look at Jim Gee's research. Okay, so finally, here's a brief exercise I would like to propose to you. As I say, here you got to see Pitfall and E.T., you got to see me playing through both games and only a small segment, but if you go to YouTube, as we mentioned last time, you're going to see extensive videos of players going through much more of both games. So what I would suggest is that you pick at least one good game and one bad game, and I have here 3 good games and 3 bad games, and that you do a more detailed analysis of these games using these elements, these components I've talked about as the basis for your analysis, for understanding, even though you may not have played these games, what makes them, in the eyes of most gamers, good or bad. As I said, here are 3 good games: Pitfall, which ran on the Atari 2600, Aladdin, which ran on the Super Nintendo, and Super Mario 64, which ran on the Nintendo 64. By contrast, here are their bad counterparts: on the 2600 ET, on the Super NES, Captain Novolin, which was a health game, which has some interesting side consequences that we'll come back to much later in the series of podcasts when we talk about serious games. And finally, on the Nintendo 64, Superman 64. It's important when you're doing these analyses to pair up a good game and a bad game on the same platform. It's not fair, for instance, to compare a game like Super Mario 64 with the additional resources and graphics available on the Nintendo 64 to a game like E.T., which ran on the Atari 2600. It's too tempting to say, well, you just see this game as bad today because it doesn't have the graphics glitz or the processor resources. So it's important to do a fair platform-to-platform comparison. All right, so that's it for this podcast. As always, here's the resources I used, in this particular case, Ralph Koster's book. So next time I'll be talking about different genres of video games and starting to make some connections as to how those genres relate to education. Until next time, enjoy your games. See you then.